Hello, darlings. It's time for bed. Tonight, we're reading The Distance. At the end of a long, long road away from the big city was a very small town called Nowhere. It was usually quite dusty in Nowhere, and there was very little things of interest to do. The one thing the town did love to do was sit at the edge and watch some moving shapes that were far, far away. There were regulars who would come over every morning to the small cafe at the edge, and would always come for dinner and particularly dull evening. "I think that they're a bunch of old rhinos," said a grumpy old man one day when the town had gathered for dinner. "I imagine they're a group of elephants," said an old lady who came every morning to discuss her fantasies. "I think they might be unicorns," said the daughter of the cafe owner. "Now, now," said the grumpy man while her mother led her away. "There isn't such a thing as unicorns." Well, you might be wondering at this point why the people of the town, or even the big city, didn't venture into the wild desert beyond the town and just find out what it was. Well, I will tell you, and it is just about the strangest thing that this little girl discovers as she's playing hopscotch. One day when the grumpy old man and the old lady were discussing with a few other adults about the prospect of what the moving shapes far, far away was, the little girl of the cafe went across the street and played some hopscotch down some ways. She was playing all by herself near the edge of the road, and she tripped. As she fell, her hand landed quite unexpectedly on a wall. Now there is nothing there, and as the little girl steadied herself, she reached out again. Carefully, cautiously, and they hit something solid and see-through, but there. She moved her hands away again and rubbed her eyes. Surely she was just imagining things. She peered her head close, leaning forward, and her head hit something. She backed away, rubbing her forehead and grumpily staring at this invisible thing. How far did this wall go? Was it just right here, or did it go all the way along the road? She reached out her hand and flattened it against this invisible wall and started walking towards home. Whatever it was very smooth. About several houses between the park and the cafe, the little girl's hands fell through and she tumbled over, landing with an oof on her shoulder to the ground. She rolled onto her back and opened her eyes, but then she sat up really fast because her head was in a huge dark green jungle. She looked around her and looked behind her, and she saw her little town through a triangular shape, glowing seemingly out of nowhere. The yellows and oranges stood brightly against the dark greens of the jungle, and she quickly stepped back home. She walked backwards and forwards for a second, and then rubbed her eyes and reached out with her hand again, and it went through. Curiously, she poked her head through, and when she did, she saw the dark green jungle again. She stepped back outside, and on the ground with her chalk, she drew 3 stars and drew another hopscotch step and an arrow. She walked a few steps back towards her home and reached out her hand and felt the wall again. She ran at home as fast as she could. She Toad past all the other old adults, and the old lady and the old man. She went up the stairs past her parents and her brothers, and hid under her blankets. When everyone had gone home from the cafe and it was dark, her mother, her older brother, and her younger brother and her dad were there waiting for her. "Are you okay?" asked her mother. "We want to know what happened," asked her father. The little girl sighed and told them all about what she had experienced. Her older brother snickered. "That's crazy," he said, and her parents smiled. Only her little brother believed her. "Can we go? Can we please go?" he said. "I know where to go," said the little girl. She glared at her parents. They all sighed and packed their bags. Still in pajamas and in slippers, they marched out with backpacks and curly rolled hair, drowsy eyes, and half awake. They followed the little girl down to the hopscotch with 3 stars. She grabbed their hands. It went her mother, her little brother, her father, and the older brother. She said, "Are you ready?" They all sleepily said yes, except for the little brother, who said, "Let's go, let's go." And she took them through. The mother nearly let go at first because her daughter vanished. But when she stepped forward through, she too saw the jungle. And every single one of them stepped through, each gasping as they were in a great, big, dark forest. As soon as the father and the older brother stepped through, the desert town behind them vanished. And they all held hands a little tighter, because now they didn't know where they were, in the middle of nowhere, with only their backpacks. The little girl stood shivering, but took a breath. She didn't know where she needed to go, but she did know that she needed to go somewhere. So she took steps forward, and they all followed her, holding hands in the deep, shifting shadows of the forest. As they stepped, in front of the little girl, a gold orb started to glow, and she continued to push forward through the thick trees and leaves. They held hands tighter, keeping close, when a large tiger jumped from the tree above them and landed in front of the little girl. They all stopped. The dad tried to go in front of the little girl, but she held her hand and said, "Dad, it's okay." The tiger took a few steps forward and touched noses with the little girl. "Come with me," the tiger whispered. They followed her up over giant tree roots that her father and brother had to help them over. They crawled underneath low-hanging branches. Once or twice, the tiger asked them to stop, and a giant snake slithered in front of them. Once, one of the tigers even hissed at the little girl. They kept going forward. They hopped over rocks, the little brother being carried by Dad. And they jumped over streams and past a huge waterfall, taller than a story building, so many stories high. Then the tiger stopped in front of a huge. She looked at the little girl and almost smiled, as tigers do. She lifted her paw. Again her dad gasped and went to protect them, and she let them. He stood in front of them, and the little girl peeked her head out from behind her father's arm and watched the tiger stick her paw through the tree. Then she purred, gave the little girl one more touch with her nose, and bounced off into the woods. They all looked at each other a little nervously, and the little girl said, "Let's go." They all held hands again together, the little girl taking the lead, the mother, the little boy, the dad, and the elder brother. And they stepped forward and found themselves in a giant green field. And before them were a bunch of moving unicorns! They all yelled. They ran with the unicorns, and the horses stampeded around them. And then they saw in the middle of all the unicorns the old woman who would tell them all their tales. She stood up and smiled, walking over to them. "Hello, my dears," she said, her long gray hair falling freely in the wind. "Hello," they all said, rather curiously. She pointed behind them, and they all turned. No longer the jungle was there, but far away through cracked desert earth, they could see their little town. The woman smiled when they turned back and handed each of them a key. "You know now the way here, but here is a key to get you anywhere that you desire." They all took their key and said thank you, and she smiled back, stepped back, and like a gust of wind, poured herself into the sky, a puff of butterflies, moths, and blackbirds. She vanished. The sun was rising after their long journey through the night, and they all spent the day with their backpacks and eating snacks and setting up a tent to play with the horses. But when the end of the day came, they thought they might really like their beds, since they'd been awake for quite some time. "What do we do?" said the mother. "I know," said the little girl. "Hold your key over your heart, close your eyes, think of where you want to go, and..." They all stepped forwards and fell into their living room. They laughed around their dinner table that night and curled up into their cozy beds, each of their keys around their necks on a necklace, because now they could go wherever it is they liked.